Hi everyone, it's that time of the month again, and I'm going to take you through some of February's paint jobs that I have really enjoyed. Not only that, but I'm going to talk about what we can learn from these paint jobs in a hope that we can move the channel a little bit more towards philosophical thoughts about painting, not necessarily always like, here's how to paint X, Y, and Z. Maybe more along the lines of why are we painting X, Y, and Z, and whether that makes any difference to us. Remember, this is not an exhaustive list of things that I've discovered this month. There were actually about 20 to 25 pieces. I've had to cut them down to 12, but I'm not going to talk any longer at the moment. Let's get into it and look at some beautiful paint jobs, and I'll speak to you a little bit at the end. Our first February foray comes from Hired Gun Studios. This is Brother Snipes' Death Company Judiciar. Two key things for me on this one, beyond the general ambience, the metals and the textures. The armour has a lot of wonderful texture built in, even in what is effectively a monochrome armour colour, although you can see both red and subtle purples coming in to tint the armour in various places. The metals also follow the same scheme, more or less, but because of the treatment you have a clear distinction between materials without a need for necessarily different colours or hues. So what are we learning here? Well, a somewhat limited palette doesn't stop you from creating a well-defined piece of miniature art. Next up is Branislav Lukacovic. Apologies if I've said that wrong, but this is his piece, Uncle Jerry. I immediately recognise my man Javier, aka Dozes 3D, as the sculptor on this one. I'm a big fan of his bust pieces in general, since they often lend themselves well to being painted. Now, in the first instance, the sculpt is of course excellent, since Branislav quite rightly points out that you could paint this up as a truck driver, or an angry uncle, or a sports fan, and actually I immediately thought golfer, considering the purple cap. So no idea why I made that connection, but ultimately there are a couple of things to love about this one. Firstly, the whites on the shirt. I think if you analyse the actual colours used here, you'd see more blue greys than whites, which might come as a surprise. The impression of white is wonderful, and the lines for the pattern and the softness of this paint job makes this look a lot like a flannel shirt, something which would be super comfortable. I'm also a big fan of the variation in colour hues in the skin. It's amazing how deep into the reds and purples you can go while still maintaining realism, and I think if we study skin a lot more when we're painting, we'll probably find that there's way more colour in there than we initially thought. Key takeaway? Things are not always the colour they seem, and it can pay off to be more brave with your skin colours. You'd be surprised how much of our skin is not really skin coloured when you take everything else like lighting into account. So next we have a simple Stormcast Liberator, which is anything but simple when you really inspect it. Mathieu Pacaud, again apologies, this is a French name so I'm going to struggle, but he has done some quite wonderful things with his paint job here, and you'll all know by now I'm a sucker for a fancy gradient. So what's going on here? Well, firstly, we have some pretty impressive non-metallic metal, which, when you look at things like the front of the skirt armour or the legs, you'd be forgiven for thinking was proper metal. Lots of tiny little reflections, specular highlights and realistic touches, but overall we have quite an unusual teal to purple gradient, which across the model touches on blues and yellows and violets. Balancing that gradient alongside the illusion of metal is a pretty impressive skill, not to mention what looks to be a lovely bit of freehand pattern painting on the chest, shield, knee pad and so on. And we've not even touched on the face and the smoothness and the emotion in that expression. Now, I think this is a work in progress, as mentioned in the post, so I'm keen to see how this pans out, but I think the learning here is twofold. One, when you're painting NMM, non-metallic metal, of course the key highlights are helpful, but smooth blends are not always the way to go if you want to imitate a shiny surface. And two, although there's gold at play here, a pretty non-traditional colour scheme using gradients seems to totally work, and there's a lot to be said for not just picking a single colour for your materials when you could theoretically run through a gradient of 2 or 3 different hues. Okay, so I don't know what this is, but I imagine someone in the comments will be able to tell me who this character is. There is something familiar about him, and I suspect this is from an anime. This cel-shaded paint job is from a Chinese painter who I only know by the Instagram handle alucard_2021, but their style seems to be very much a cel-shaded approach if you look at all of their other pieces. This caught my eye because once again it's that teal to purple gradient across the model, but more specifically the drama, the contrast, the expression on the face, all of it really jumped out at me. What's interesting here is there are not many gradients. There is the bottom of the cloak, the fire on the right hand side, some subtle gradients on the feathers and in the hat, but many of the transitions here are actually pretty solid. As you start to look deeper though, this is more than just simple cel shading. There is the subtle hue and value variation in almost every material, and even if the OSL style lighting is quite stark, you've graduated changes behind that. The hat is a really good example here. The base colour of the hat is, I guess, black, but you have this mid-tone purple to teal gradient from right to left, and then on top of that you've got the lighting. Of course, the dark lining on this model helps also sell that cartoon vibe, and I think it's a really solid example of this style being pretty much perfectly executed. So what do we learn here? Well, impact and impressive paint jobs don't need to be in a particular style. Whatever route you decide to take stylistically can result in an emotionally and technically impressive outcome. Next up, we have Magnus Nielsen's Fomoroid Crusher, and I assume anybody heading to Adepticon next month will be able to see this piece in the flesh. On the topic of flesh, that's one of a couple of really standout bits for me. The difference in hue between the front and the back is one thing, but if you look at it, we have a huge amount of subtlety from warm purple into cream, going up the value range on the legs and the belly, while we have this colder, very, very dark purple into mid-blue grey for what reads as closer to black skin on the arms and the back, and the execution on the skin alone is spectacular. The other thing I'm going to highlight on this is the shoulder pad. Now, I've painted this model some years ago and that shoulder pad is pretty much flat. There's some rough texture, but what Magnus has done here with his NMM is emphasise this dimple pattern to look like hammered metal. Not only has he managed to do that, but he's done it across value ranges so that you can see the darker dimples across the middle of the shoulder pad and the lighter dimples across the top and bottom where the reflections are. And the ability, the planning and the execution on that with such finesse is probably why Magnus took trophies at his first and second Golden Demon ever. What am I learning from this? Well, firstly, I've got a long way to go before I can execute at this high a level, but that aside, there's a lesson here about not necessarily allowing the sculpt to determine what you do with the model. Texture, lighting and paint application can all help you tell the story that you want to tell, even if the sculpt doesn't initially point in that direction. Okay, next up, we're going to look at two work-in-progress models from a forthcoming squad project, which you will hopefully be able to see if you're planning to attend MPO in Bristol in the UK later this year. Josh is knocking it out the park with these Marines at the moment, and I cannot wait to see how this comes together. The first thing I notice about both of these pieces is of course the lighting. What's your typical highlight colour for black armour? Grey? Blue? White? People often lean towards cold or desaturated colours on black armour, but with these, Josh is highlighting up to this beautiful, warm, sunny tone and right up to ivory and maybe even white on the highest value points. So suddenly, instead of feeling like the Marines are sitting in isolation on a base, they're placed in this environment where there's a warm sun. Maybe the sun is setting, maybe it's a desert planet, maybe it's the glow from an explosion, but either way, just by changing the traditional highlight colour, we get so much more about the scene than we would normally. Not only that, but we've got this rich, textured, wonderful yellow, which in my book is always going to go well with black. So what's our key learning here? Easy. Pay attention to your lighting. The way you decide to hypothetically light your miniatures can help tell a big part of the story that you want to convey, and it's not just the model or the sculpt or even the paint job in its most simple form, but it's how these elements react to the environment that they're placed in. Okay, so if this mini looks familiar, you'll remember it featured last month, but in a completely different way. Now, although there's a different head on this is still, I believe, the Cybergirl project that Joaquin Palacios sculpted, which last month Nacho Gonzalez had painted and called Curico. Either way, this is a completely different take on essentially the same model, this time with some very clever transparency and rain effects painted on. I've never attempted it, but my gut feeling is that this is not an easy effect to pull off well, and that Jorge Ross, aka Graphic Monkey, has really smashed it out of the park here. Granted, the subject matter of robots, cyberpunk and Blade Runner vibes has already got me interested, but there is so much to dig into here. The differences in material rendering when the jacket is clearly next to skin versus when it's hanging off, the subtle red and purple tones in the skin elsewhere, the vibrancy in that luminous yellow, and even things like change in hue from one side of the model to the other. Also, the denim rendering here is exceptional. There is a lot to like about this piece, certainly from my point of view, and I guess the sad thing is I don't know if I'll ever get to see this in hand. The learnings from this one for me are more about how different paint jobs can be, even when the sculpt is more or less the same. So your own decisions and your own ideas can produce vastly different results, even when that canvas is similar or the same. So don't be restricted by what others have already done. Next up is this dramatic piece from Lukas, aka Mirage Builds on Instagram. This sculpt, which is named Fatalis Boy, is one that you can download from the sculptor Alejandro Munoz, his My Mini Factory page. For me, this is a wonderfully dramatic piece of painting. The strong cast shadows and vibrant colouring do wonders, but you'll notice it's still a relatively small group of colours on the whole. Blue and red accent colours, but otherwise lots of warm browns and cream tones and all very similar in hue. The shadows are one of the standout things here for me. If you're going to paint cast shadows, the trick is making sure they're everywhere. You can't have one thing cast a shadow but everything else not. Everywhere on this model though has taken that into account. I also specifically like the transition between the shadow and the light areas. It's most powerful and noticeable maybe on the side of the face, but there's a very saturated, very small blend between the light of the face and the desaturated shadow areas. And I think that sort of attention to detail is crucial if you want to bring out that realism. I think the restricted palette here also works really well. The red and the blue coming in on the feathers, the necklace and the knife. Maybe that's quite obvious, but then you've got the eye colour is also blue. The line work on the skull is darker blue. The straps holding the teeth on the arm are red. The tones in the redder parts of the face, like lips, nose and that shadow blend, they're all working well together. I think the lesson here is twofold. First, if you want to go for something dramatic and realistic with cast shadows painted on, then pay attention to the realism, since it's not always just going to be a dark wash or a filter over your shadow area and a simple line transition between values. Secondly, the selection of that focused colour scheme is very powerful, so don't be afraid to reuse your kind of highlight or spot colours on different elements across the model to help bring it all together. A fun one for you now, this is Bine, who goes by bi.miniatures on Instagram, and her take on King Thule from Lucas Pina, but also the astronaut challenge posed by Roman Lepat. Done as a part of a Dogma 48 gathering, where you have 48 hours to work on something ideally outside your comfort zone, this seems to have come together very quickly. I was first drawn to this because I love abandoned ruins style things anyway, but I was immediately impressed, since actually this is one of the only pieces involving that King Tool sculpt that I've really fully enjoyed. I've never really been a huge fan of the sculpt, both in subject matter and in the pose, but this seems to bring it to a place that I can really appreciate it, which came as a nice surprise. Of course, there's some wonderful texture and paintwork here, as well as some great sculpting and terrain building, and of course the astronauts immediately bring the sense of scale to the model for me. It's no longer a king looking forlorn at a goblet, but it's a giant ancient monument from a long time ago. Interestingly, in the first photo, I almost missed the bird and the red flowers as a focus, and I was still drawn to the main face and then the astronaut up top, but like many good pieces, the longer I looked, the more I discovered. There's a great learning here in that you don't need to work to the scale that the model exists in to begin with. If you want to change things, there's really no end to the way that you can play with this. I think it helps to just consider an approach where you're working at a different scale to the model, and who knows what that might spark in terms of creativity. Okay, so now we have a bust called Avalynne from Life Miniatures. This paint job caught my eye because it was just so different to what I normally enjoy. This is the work of Natalie, aka evalaina on Instagram, and what a piece this is. The obvious thing here is the use of colour. Not that hugely punchy, saturated colour, but the subtleties of carefully chosen pastel tones in the skin, lots of light tones which all seem to work very well together, and of course the kind of blue, yellow and green sort of chromatic style blends around the eyes and the cheeks. Going in this direction, I suppose there's a danger that everything becomes desaturated and nothing really stands out, and that as you go darker, colours begin to get muddy once you start layering, and all the skill on display here in avoiding that is abundant. I love the smoothness in the blends and the transitions on display, and even just things like the subtle red shadows on the underside of the arm, or the difference in value from just the forehead to the neck. Everything has been considered here, but all while keeping it somehow just so soft and subtle. And one of the reasons I love this is because I have no idea how I'd even start a piece like this, and maybe that's something we can take as a learning. Find inspiration in places you might not expect it. Granted, this is still miniature painting, but I wouldn't have expected a piece like this to catch my eye, nor would I be particularly drawn to this set of colours or this subject matter typically. But when executed well, it really gives me ideas about what might be possible and how I might be able to take some of those ideas into my own work. Next up is Martin Goumaz's fun little Termagaunt. This was painted for a little Warhammer store Geneva challenge, and this was something I really enjoyed because it was breaking some rules a little bit, right? Of course, there is some beautiful painting work. After all, Martin has won a Slayer sword and Best of Painting at Monte Sansovino in his time, but the reds and pinks towards the front into the deep dark but saturated blues at the back is already a really nice little gradient and piece of painting work. But almost hilariously so, the star of the show here seems to be the tuft placement, right? Basing with tufts is one thing, but incorporating them into the mini is a really interesting technique. I love the story we're telling here. Whether it's camouflage or just a question of time spent in the undergrowth or whatever it might be, either way we're now suddenly beyond the miniature. We've taken a step either forward or backwards, and we have this rhetoric being implied by the piece. And I think a lot of the best pieces do that. They tell a story either side of the miniature in the instant that you're seeing it. For Martin to achieve that in such a simple way is quite incredible. I'm not saying this is a simple paint job, I'm just very much appreciating that the simplicity of the idea here is what's doing a lot of that storytelling. So the learning here is maybe about exploring options. Maybe basing materials don't just belong on the base. Maybe the story you want to tell can come through selective placement of elements, and perhaps to make a difference, you don't need to stray too far from the norm. We're going to finish February with this cracking piece from Normandy Painting. Now, I don't know their real name, but they're French, and it will come as no surprise to you to learn that they're currently living in Nottingham and working for Warhammer as part of the heavy metal painting team. Now, I don't know if this was inspired by Drupal's Van Saar Ganger, which took silver at the Specialist Games Day Golden Demon in 2018 or not, but that is another cracking yellow Van Saar model if you want one. I think the reality here though is this is about as crisp as it gets. That super rich yellow, the clarity and the readability of every single element on show, and knowing just how small and fiddly these models are really adds to the impressiveness here. You'd be forgiven for thinking this was maybe a 75mm scale piece, since there's really not a brushstroke out of place. But these things are probably closer to 28mm scale, and seeing things like the outlining on the bottom of the foot, the highlighting on the fingers holding the gun, and the detail in the eye is just really something else. I think this is a really solid example of a super crisp, tight, and incredibly well-controlled paint job. The learning here for me, certainly is one I think that everybody at every level can probably understand. Much like status symbol boat owners will always know there's someone with a bigger boat, painters should always probably realise that there will be someone who is a better painter than you. Now, I have to be careful about my use of the word better here, since it can be very subjective and we all view this differently, but I think irrespective of your definition of the word better, you'll likely agree that there are better painters than you are. And I think the point is that in realising this, we're trying not to put ourselves off. We're remembering that there's always room to get better. I find it massively inspiring to see paint jobs far better than I could achieve, because it helps me consider what I might need to do to improve. It reminds me that I don't necessarily want to plateau in terms of skills, and that if I put my mind to it, I can better myself and continue to move forward. Now, hopefully, in seeing all of these pieces, you also feel the same. Thank you so much to all the painters that I have featured in this month's roundup. Keep putting out incredible paint jobs. I really appreciate it. If you want to find any of the links to any of those pieces that I've mentioned, they're all in the description. If you had a favourite, please let me know in the comments, or you can sign up to Discord and you can discuss them with me however you like, basically. It's free. It's also free to subscribe, so if you want to subscribe and or like this and get involved in the discussion, then that would be brilliant. It also means that you'll probably catch next month's when that rolls around, although in March I am going to Adepticon, so if you're going, please come and say hi to me. I'll be there with a few pals, but always happy to talk to people. If you've not met me, don't feel afraid to come and say hello. But as a result, March's roundup might be a little bit different, so we'll see how we get on there. But anyway, thank you once again for listening to me ramble on about other people's paint jobs instead of showing you how to like paint sand on a base or whatever. And yeah, we'll get some of those videos in there as well, don't worry. But yeah, thank you very much and speak to you next time.